2004 through 2013 Range Rover Sport lower control arm replacement. I'm Brian Essick from How to Automotive. I'm going to walk you step by step through that process. Okay, to get started replacing the lower control arms, what we need to do is we need to turn the ignition key on. So you'll push it until all the lights on the dash light up. Then right here on the console here, we need to put the suspension in access mode. And by pushing the lock button down here. And that puts it in access mode. That way we can lift the vehicle up and service the suspension. Once it's in access mode, then you can just shut the key off by pushing the button. Now we need to get the front of the vehicle in the air. If you're doing this at home, you want to jack it up over here on the frame and you want the suspension hanging. Make sure you use floor jacks and jack stands for safety. Then you can go ahead and remove your front wheels. I'm going to use my Milwaukee M18 Fuel 3H drive impact gun here. So I'm going to be replacing left and right. The process is going to be the same for both sides. So I'll link these parts up in the description of the video. That way if you need to pick those up, you can find those there. So I'm going to take off the 24mm ball joint nut here. I'm going to use my Milwaukee M18 Fuel here to make quick work of that. After getting that removed, I'm actually going to screw it back on a few threads. And then I'm going to get a puller and separate the ball joint. I'll walk you through that process now. So I'm going to use a puller from my hub grappler kit. The puller, you can get this puller separately. So the way we do it is we hook it around the ball joint like this. And then we use our impact gun here and run it up. And that applies pressure on the end of the ball joint. So as we apply pressure, you're also may want to use a hammer and strike the ball joint right here. That little vibration that's shocking will help break it free. So you'll strike it and then run it in with the gun, and then you'll go back and forth running in a few threads, strike it, and then you'll get it to pop free or pop open like this. Now that the ball joint's pop free, we need to remove the axle nut and push the axle through. So I'm going to use my Milwaukee M18 Fuel again and a 32mm socket and remove the axle nut. The torque spec on the axle nut is 170 foot-pounds and the impact gun is rated at 200. So once you get the axle nut off, you want to push the axle in like this until you got a gap. Now that the axle nut is free and the ball joint is free, the next step is we're going to remove the bolt here going through the center of the strut. You're going to need a 21mm wrench and a 24mm socket. This bolt is torqued down to 220 pounds of torque, and I'm going to put my little gun to the test and see if it'll break it free. This will be putting the gun at its limits on the torque, so we'll see what happens. And as you can see, it broke the bolt free with no problem. So once you get the nut off, you can go ahead and just pound the bolt through and pull it out. Now we're ready to remove the bolts on the rear of the control arm, but before we do it, I'm going to put a little whiteout on the cam lobes here. These little eccentrics are what align the camber and caster on the vehicle. So I'm going to put a little dab of whiteout on it, so when we put it back together, it's going to go back together in the ballpark, and our alignment won't be really far off. So I'm going to put it on all four the cam lobes and make a mark, so when I put it back together, we're in the ballpark. So once you take the 24mm nut off and take the washer off, then you're going to just push the hammer the bolt through on the opposite side. Also keep note on how the bolts go through, so when we put it back together, we'll put it back in the exact same way. To get the rear part of the control arm out, you'll have to rotate the bolt till the eccentric is at its lowest spot to clear the sway bar right here. So once you get it there, you can just use a little hammer and tap it, and it'll drive the bolt out. Now that you got the two rear bolts out, we need to remove the lower skid plate here. It makes contact with the front part of the arm. So we're going to have to remove the bolts around the perimeter of it. Once the skid plate's removed, then you can take a pry bar and pry the arm down like this. So now we're going to make sure we push the axle through like this, and then we're going to make sure that gap is there. That way when we go to lift the control arm out, it'll come right out. When I was working with it, the axle kept sliding back in. So to combat, what I did was take a tie strap and hooked it on the bottom of the suspension here, on the caliper, and I looped it around and hooked it onto the top of the strut tower up here. And then I ratcheted it, and then what that did was pull the bottom of the spindle outwards, and it allowed me to push the axle through, and then that created that gap. And then with that gap, then you can angle the control arm at an angle and remove the lower control arm. So when we go to put it back together, we'll put the ball joint in first. And then what we're going to do is put a little blue thread locker on the nut, the 24mm nut, and thread that on. And we're going to tighten this up in a minute. For right now, we're just going to start the thread so the control arm doesn't pop back out. Now we're going to line up the bottom of the strut right here with the control arm, and then lift the control arm back up into position and start the two bolts in the back. So you're going to put the bolts back in the same way that they came out originally. So after stabbing the two rear bolts and putting the nuts on and running it up till they're snug, next we're going to put the bolt through the strut here. So you're going to need a long pry bar, and you're going to have to pry downwards, and then a second pry bar here to kind of pry the strut back like this to help line up the bolt hole, and then you're going to stab the bolt through. Now that you got those bolts installed, next we're going to tighten up the ball joint here. So I'm going to run it up with my impact gun until it's snug, and then I'm going to use my torque wrench and torque it down to 85 foot-pounds. Now that the ball joint's tight, we need to preload the suspension. So we're going to try to get it back to stock ride height, and then once we get it there, we'll tighten up the two bolts in the back. The two rear ones are 203 foot-pounds, so we'll torque these down to 203 foot-pounds, and then after that we'll torque the strut one here to 220 foot-pounds. But first we need a pull jack or a floor jack, and we need to push the suspension upwards. And we're going to take a measurement from the top of the fender well here to the center of the axle nut here, and the measurement should read 18¼ inches or 463 millimeters. If we were to tighten the bolts with the suspension hanging down, when you lowered the vehicle, it would actually rip and tear the bushings. So you want to get that suspension to as close to natural ride height as we can possibly get it. If you got this on a hoist and you're putting pressure on it, and it's actually kind of trying to lift the vehicle off the rack, then you may want to put the wheels back on and lower it down to the ground, and then get it at that stock ride height, and then tighten the bolts up. So the front bolt here is torqued at 220 foot-pounds. The rear ones are torqued at 203 foot-pounds. And you want to line up those eccentric cams. And once you get that all done, then you can go ahead and lower down the suspension. Then you can torque down the axle nut to 170 foot-pounds. And then once you do that, you want to ding in the little indentation right here with a punch that prevents it from backing back off. Then you can go ahead and reinstall the tires and torque those down to 104 foot-pounds. So I just demonstrated the driver's side. The passenger side is the exact same process. Once you get that done, you can go ahead and reinstall your shield, your skid plate, and then you can lower your vehicle down, start the vehicle, and then reactivate your suspension by flipping the switch here. So I'm going to link up all the parts and tools that I use in the description of the video. That way, if you need to pick up the parts, you can find those there. I especially think the impact gun will be extremely helpful for a job like this, so I'll definitely link that up in the description. And that'll complete the job of replacing the lower control arms on a 2004 through 2013 Range Rover Sport. I'm Brian Essick from How To Automotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching my videos, encourage you to subscribe, and invite you to head over to the howtoautomotive.com website for more valuable videos like this. Thank you again for watching.